Stinger, welcome back to 10th Century. Thanks for joining us again.
Thanks for having me.
So we did the Syria conversation last time around, and it'd be interesting this time around maybe to talk about how you got into the Air Force. You're a front seater, a Strike Eagle pilot right now, but you started off in the back seat. So can you tell us about your journey into the Air Force and how it is that you went, first of all, to NAV or WSO?
Sure. Well, started out a long time ago. Joined Civil Air Patrol actually when I was really young, like 15 or 16, and got a little scholarship into this thing called a National Flight Academy, and sent you out to Oshkosh, Wisconsin, and soloed a 172 there, and that's pretty much it. Didn't fly really much past that point. Did the whole normal high school thing, and then started the whole college deal. So ended up having to go to a community college to get my degree, and it ended up being a 4-year degree. Throughout that time, worked about 3 or 4 jobs in between, minimum wage jobs like prep cook and all that sort of jazz, and still wanted to fly, just didn't really have the money for it. So volunteered as much as I could at the airport to try to make friends and wash airplanes and meet people and stuff, and still make some money if I could. So I started washing airplanes at the airport and helped a friend that I knew who was a mechanic there start turning wrenches in the hangar, and he graciously allowed me to get some hours with his flight school when they had the chance. So did that, and ended up getting my private when I was about 23 or 24, and ended up working towards a commercial and multi and all that sort of stuff, and that worked out pretty well. But it was all from washing airplanes and doing odd jobs at the airport and stuff like that. So and then working a couple different jobs throughout the summertime and whatnot. So did that. And met a incredible group of people at the airport that had some old warbirds, and they asked me if I wanted to fly with them. I said sure, and got checked out, and some of that stuff started going to static displays at air shows with an old Chinese CJ6 trainer, which was a lot of fun to fly. And then I started working for a group of guys down in the Caribbean, South America area, and delivering airplanes down there that they would pick out and buy, and kind of brokered some deals with buying some airplanes in the U.S. And it introduced me to a lot of different types and stuff, and ended up getting a multi-C and a single C commercial, as well as a L39 type rating and some other stuff. That was all just happenstance. That worked out pretty good from meeting people and all that sort of jazz. So started taking airplanes to air shows, and simultaneously I worked for a skydiving company making almost no money. I moved to this little trailer park in New York, and was making like $10 a day or something flying skydivers just to build up time to try to be appealing to somebody somewhere. Did that for a while. Still did static displays at air shows. Ran into a really awesome dude named Jared Isaacman, and he asked me if I wanted to come eventually work with them and do some stuff that he was doing with a jet team, and that worked out really well. So got involved in some cooler airplanes, met a lot of more interesting people, and it just so happened that the group of guys that I started working with were a lot of retired fighter pilots, really awesome, incredible guys. And that's kind of what I wanted to do before I got too old. So I threw down for a bunch of different opportunities, whether it was Navy, Air Force, or Guard, et cetera. Long story short, got turned down by quite a few, and then picked up eventually by the Air Force active duty, and they offered me a WSO slot, which wasn't my number one choice, but it was going to be cool. And I was coming up against the age bracket, so that I probably wasn't going to be able to get an age waiver to get in. So I took the WSO slot and said it'd be awesome to go serve and get some great experiences, and then go fly the F-15, which would be what I wanted to do and get into fighters and all that stuff. So did that, went to OTS, and then went to CISO training in Pensacola and the F-15B course in North Carolina, and then went to England for my first assignment, and then kept every year. I would every year when I was eligible, I'd start applying and for pilot training, and I got rejected a few times, a few years, and then finally, my last year of applying, I got picked up, and then went to Shepherd to NJEP to Euro-NATO Joint Jet Pilot Training for pilot training, and then dropped F-15s or F-15Es, and then went back to the community that way. So that's pretty much the whole story summed up in a not so short tale. So.
Did you, when you were growing up then, obviously, if you were scrimping and saving and you had put yourself through commercial license to the point where you were a commercial pilot, as a result of it sounds like sort of blood, sweat and tears, and not coming from a position of wealth or having somebody else pay for it for you, sounds like you were passionate about aviation, and you must have been for your whole life. But did it take meeting that group of fighter pilots to get you to the point where you wanted to be a fighter pilot? Did the L-39 check out? Did that sort of turn you on to the idea of that being a career field?
I think so. The L-39 checkout came to me through some pretty cool circumstances, and I would say most of the opportunities I got were just a matter of like luck, timing, and a lot of like good bullshitting over beers. And then one thing leads to another, and you just try to make things happen. And as well, as far as going back and flying fighters, no. So when I was growing up, I had read almost every fighter pilot's autobiography and biography from World War II. I was reading Thunderbolt by Robert S. Johnson. I had read Bob Hoover's story, and Bud Anderson, all these guys, and they were pretty. I thought they were pretty cool. And so as I was going to this community college, I really I didn't think that I had the pedigree to be able to get into the Air Force or Navy with a pilot slot. So I figured I'll have to keep working at it and trying to increase the credentials as I can. And one of these ways to do it was try to get through a commercial rating, at least, with a bunch of hours. And I really enjoyed flying, and I really enjoyed flying different types of airplanes and kind of shooting from the hip and doing some other stuff. And we got into some aerobatics, and I briefly dabbled with trying to get into aerobatic competitions with the pits that had an opportunity to fly, a handful of times, and I really enjoyed it. But the cool thing about the aviation circle was that you can find another group of people with a passion for aviation and get plugged in with them, and they share that, your enthusiasm for aviation, and they'll try to help you out. And that's kind of just the way the aviation family sort of is. If you spend time, washing airplanes and turning wrenches at the airport, you're pretty much bound to have somebody who's going to let you, fly their airplane or fly with them, or it's all about sharing this aviation experience. So I really enjoyed that. And the other thing was that I didn't want to, for me personally, I didn't want to go through life while I had the chance to be a fighter pilot and not take it or not fight for it as much as I could. So I said, you know what, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to have to, claw my way to making this happen, which is exactly what it ended up being. And it was actually a lot more work than I thought it was going to be, but it's just as rewarding. So I'm pretty thankful I did that. The L-39 type just kind of confirmed what I had already thought about stuff. And man, I loved it. And I love formation flying and loved everything. It's probably not as good as some people are at it, but I loved it, all the same. So
is there, when you're making that decision then to join the Air Force as an AB or a weapons systems officer, and you've got all this flight time or experience behind you, maybe not massively experienced, but you put yourself through all these ratings and you're used to being the person driving the bus, Is there a part of you that you really have to manage, or a part of your psyche that you have to manage when you're sitting in the back seat, which says, don't be distracted by the thought of getting to the front, do your job well in this role, and don't spend time thinking, well, I wish I was strapping into the front seat, not the back seat?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a piece of that. One of the most profound areas, I think, where that manifests itself is during BFM or dogfighting or whatever, because you have a role definitely in the backseat, but BFM is a pretty front seat intensive mission set, and it's so much fun. And so every time we would go out and do that, I was always daydreaming about being in the front seat and what I would do differently, or that I could be better at it, and that sort of natural competition that you'd get yourself into. Overall, I'll caveat that and say, when I first went in, I really didn't appreciate what WSOs did in the backseat of the Strike Eagle. And I don't think a lot of single pilot jets really understand the complexity and the immersion into tactics that WSOs get to do. When you're flying in the front seat, you have a lot of things that you have to concentrate on. Obviously, flying and not hitting the ground or anything attached to the ground. Where you're going to put your jet, from a geometry perspective, and just general safety stuff and systems and everything like that. Usually, when you're in the backseat, you can really dive into tactics, and you can really dive into what all is happening in the air and what's happening on the ground, and then how to meld those things together with the weapons that you have, and then the other formation members that you have. So I really found some sort of satisfaction in that, of getting as tactical as possible with being a WSO, and really learning from the patches in our squadron and other guys that had a lot of experience, being able to just make stuff happen. And nobody's really good at it when they start. There's some fast burners for sure, but nobody's super good at it. And it takes experience, and it takes a lot of critical thinking, and then it takes usually real world combat experience, and that all kind of melds together to try to create this good tactician sense. And I really enjoyed that. I thought it was really challenging. Loved it. So that kind of kept kept everything intact as far as just being 100% towards being a pilot in the front overall. So,
did it feel? If it's not a strange question, but did it feel like a bit of a risk? Because I suppose that the reason I say it's a bit of a strange question is because principally people are motivated to join the military to serve their country. And I wonder, how much of that is sort of, yes, that's true, but really I'm joining because I want to fly fighters. Was there a component to that was therefore risky for you? Did you have a game plan for when you had your final opportunity to apply for UPT, if that had not gone through, would you have served a shorter term in the Air Force?
I think potentially. Just being 100% realistic, I think that's definitely a potential. There's some cool opportunities in the Air Force that, if you're, I wouldn't say ambitious enough, but I would say passionate enough, you can get yourself into some great opportunities, whether you're a WSO or whether you're a pilot. That can be just as personally fulfilling or personally satisfying, I guess, as it would, anything else. And what I really didn't want to do was look back on life and not have served or done my part or played a role in something when I had the opportunity to, so that was kind of the ultimate goal there. As far as flying fighters now, personally, I couldn't imagine not flying fighters. It would be great. Don't get me wrong. I think there's a lot of great airframes out there and a lot of really cool flying. I know AFSOC, or the Special Operations Command, does great flying to austere places, and they have a lot of fun in what they do. But I couldn't imagine just not flying fighters. So that was kind of the goal. And so I would say probably 90% of it was service driven. and probably 10% of it was fighter driven, specific to flying fighters. But the fighter thing was definitely a constant. I would say the whole entire way for sure. I don't know. It's hard to explain, but I guess most fighter pilots would identify themselves with all the guys that they've read in the past, and kind of naturally drawn to that genre of fighting. If you come up with that term, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious. It's a bit of a sort of diversion from the stuff we normally talk about on this channel, because we're really mostly talking about aeroplanes and sort of how to fly them and stuff. But I suppose ego is something that most people have to some degree or another, and fighter pilots probably have to a greater degree than a lesser degree. And some people see their identity in what they do for a living, and saying to somebody I'm a fighter pilot is different to saying to somebody I'm a navigator or a weapons systems officer.
It's interesting because there's so my year group that all the guys that I went to officer training with, we had a lot of people that got picked up for CISO slot, so a nav slot, essentially. And they didn't know whether they're going to be a C-130 nav or an F-15, WSO or whatever. And they came from, commercial pilot backgrounds. As a matter of fact, our patch in our squadron, who's a WSO, was a regional airline pilot for quite a few years before he went to the Air Force. So and he's not the only one. There's a bunch of different guys who had a well-developed civilian flying lives prior to being a WSO. So for me, it was just kind of a personal goal to always get there. And I guess if you identified as a pilot early enough, you just always wanted to make it happen and try your best to be able to get there. And I was fortunate enough to be able to make that happen. And I really do think that I was fortunate because there's so many things that are out of your hands when it comes to making that transition happen. Depends on the needs of the Air Force, and depends on how many pilots they need that year. And it's a lot of it you can work your ass off and not get, not get to what you want. So, but you got to try, right? So that's what we kind of did. And from an ego perspective, I mean, I obviously have a little bit different perspective because of being a WSO, but I think from an ego perspective, there's a huge fulfillment that comes from being a WSO that is hard to explain. And it's more in the tactical realm of being able to make stuff happen at the tactical level, which I think is really, really cool. And a lot of guys, like I said before, who are, single seat fighter guys, and that's all they've ever wanted, and that's all they've ever achieved, usually don't quite understand that. But for the Strike Eagle community itself, I feel like we have a little bit more of a transparency or a little bit more of equality when it comes to the WSO pilot relationship and being able to make stuff happen. So a lot of WSOs are really content with what they're doing and how they're contributing to the mission, which is very, very profound. When I fly CAS or close air support as a pilot now, it is way boring, like super boring. When flying CAS as a WSO is just incredible. Like you're calling all the shots, you know what's going on, and you're just making stuff happen, and it's great. And you have a really good relationship with the ground guys, and you just you're really making stuff happen. Now, when I fly BFM as a pilot, I feel a lot better, obviously. So there's that trade-off, but I wouldn't. I think a lot of WSOs are pretty happy with where they're at. It's more of a silent professional deal, because you can go to a red flag or you can go to other multi-MDS exercise, and some of the WSOs get shit on from time to time for being WSOs, and they're always talked down to from some single seat fighters and all that sort of stuff, and but a lot of those guys just don't quite understand, so they kind of brush it off as whatever.
Do you think that the F-15EX, the Eagle 2, I think the Air Force has very unimaginatively named it, is coming soon. Or I think the first two have been delivered to the Air Force already, and they're going to go to guard units. I know you're not a C model guy, but they're going to go to guard units, Eagle units. They're two-seaters, the EX. And you've said a couple of times that in many instances those single seat guys just don't really understand the value of or what the WSO can bring to the fight. Is there a sort of an obvious way of sort of sharing that benefit? I mean, would you expect, for example, or would there be any benefit to some C model guys coming in and flying, with E model squadrons and spending time with WSOs? How do you think that you can change? Because presumably the Air Force needs to, but how do you think you can change the perception of the weapons systems officer in amongst those single seat units?
That's a super good question, and if I'll follow it with kind of a complicated answer, if that's all right. So there's good sides being a single seat fighter or single seat. A new single seat fighter, and there's good sides to having a WSO and all the things that a WSO could do. There's bad things as well. So I'll start with kind of the bad from the WSO perspective, and then we'll talk about how to meld in the single seat guys. So one of the bad things about our community specifically is that the WSO does a lot of stuff in the back that could otherwise be done with some sort of automation. And we could harness technology in new kinds of ways to do WSO things. Some of the WSO population think that they don't really think it's a threat to their job, or I'm not going to say that, but to their skill set rather. And then we don't have a lot of WSOs that imagine how they could do more in their skill set by leveraging additional technology and a lot of other stuff. I'm a firm believer that the strike eagle community, and not just the strike eagle jet, but the strike eagle community, being a pilot and WSO combination, I think can do amazing stuff. And I think if we started to really push technology to its limits from what a backseater can do as far as controlling a lot of events that are happening in a mission and doing a lot of other things, I think we could handle a lot of problem sets that nobody ever imagined. So instead, the strike eagle community is guilty of kind of staying in the past, as it were, and what I would call reenacting the Gulf War every day almost. And so you have WSOs who are doing things that could otherwise be done, with some sort of automation or new technology or whatever it is. And we're not really evolving fast because those missions are getting done by WSO. If you look at the development from the F4 to the F-15A, a lot of things that the WSO was doing in the F4 turned into automated processes in the F-15A, specifically the radar and some other sensors and et cetera, right? So there was less of a need for a WSO, and there was a little bit more of a technology fill in there. If we so that's good because that's a natural evolution of process and stuff. For the F-15 community, the single seat community, I think that they're limited by having a single person in the jet about what they can do. It may be cool, and you may be the only guy who runs the show, and that may be a great ego thing or whatever, which is cool, and you may be the final arbiter of what happens in your jet, which is great. But as far as from a mission set perspective, if you have another person there that's solely concentrated on a lot of emerging technology and a lot of emerging capabilities, you can grow that airframe a lot faster. So if you take the normal single seat guys, and then hopefully we could use some WSOs that are a little bit more forward thinking, or like I said, harness some emerging technology, et cetera. I think we could get everybody to start to see the benefits of that. Overall, I'm not a huge fan of the EX. I don't like it personally, which is probably not the right thing to say career-wise, for myself. But I'll give you the God's honest opinion. I don't really like Boeing at all. And there's numerous reasons why I would say that, but the EX is, in my opinion, not a good deal for the Air Force. So I can't imagine it being that great of an aircraft going into the future. I don't think it's very forward thinking. I don't think it's what we need to spend money on. Again, those are 100% my own views, my own personal opinions, not the DoD, all that caveat. But if we really wanted to move forward with capabilities, technology, et cetera, I think that the two-person concept is a natural iterative process for that. We just have to push it a little bit more. It was a super convoluted answer your question, and I'm not even sure it actually answered your question. But those are some random scattered thoughts for you.
It did, and my questions are always convoluted and verbose. I could probably ask them in much fewer words. So thank you for that. So we're taking a different direction than in this conversation by talking about EX and future capabilities and what the Air Force might do better or could do better. Originally, we were going to go down and talk about your experience going to the front seat, but let's stay with, if it's okay, with just for the moment, and sure, your vision for what's required. There are things like the Loyal Wingman program, which by the sounds of it, you definitely need somebody in the backseat to run, or it's optimal to have somebody in the backseat running that. If you're going to have a bunch of drones, then AI obviously is important, but it has its limitations. There are some things you definitely want a man in the loop or a woman in the loop to make decisions on. So that seems to suit a two-person crew concept quite well. What would you spend your money on then if you were, if it's not the F-15EX? What would be a better deal? Where would the money be better spent? What would it look like?
So if I was king for a day and I could control the PPBE process and everything, and it was all just my own vision, what I would do is I would start aircraft competitions that were based over like a 10-year span at the most for a 10-year contract buy. And I would reload the defense industrial complex with, specifically in the aviation sector, with at least 10 primes that were capable of producing aircraft. And then I would have them each compete with each other. And then we would start to evolve as a military aviation society. If you look at it right now, there's just a ton of consolidation. So there's three majors, right, in aerospace as far as the U.S. is concerned. We have Boeing, Lockheed, and Northrop. And all those are consolidations of consolidations of consolidations. So spanning aircraft contracts over like 50 years kills internal competition. Bottom line, right? If you make if you say, hey, we're going to buy a fighter and we're going to buy it over 40 or 50 years, nobody in any other company that doesn't win that bid wants to stick around to try to make fighters, right? And then you're held hostage by the companies that you have. So when they don't iterate fast enough or good enough, i.e. Boeing, then you won't have this iteration that happens in a combat sense or a combat capability sense, which is exactly where we're at right now. So we have to change that dramatically. I like to say this, is that we look back on the first flight of the Eagle, right, in 1972. So F-15A comes online in 1972. We're looking at buying the EX, a very, very marginally improved version of the same fighter. As a matter of fact, in most cases, it has the same subsystems that the original Eagles had. And it's crazy because some of these subsystems are problems in and of itself from a sustainability, but they're using the same subsystems. And the motor, so the 120i motor that was originally drafted for this, and granted there's an engine competition going on right now, but it's designed in the late 80s. Come on, like we're talking 30 years ago, this engine technology, and you're throwing what? You're kidding. So anyway, so let's just say it's 49 years ago from the first flight of the original Eagle, right? The A model. Now we go back in time to 1918, 1919, or whatever. Fabric wing biplanes Now you go 49 years into the future, and then you have the Mach 3 SR-71, right? So you have this like huge, spiral in technology that's caused by competition, but externally, which happened to be war, and then you have competition, which is internally. So at the height of this huge production of, just going from Mach 1 to Mach 2 to Mach 3, we had like something like 19 primes that were all trying to get, claw their way to a piece of the defense budget, right? And then you go on into the 60s and 70s, et cetera, and you look at like Lockheed. And Lockheed, to my knowledge, wasn't even making fighters when they came up with the idea for the F-117, when they started saying, hey, stealth can be a thing with, we can design this, all this sort of stuff. And it was unsolicited at that point, from my understanding as well. So traditionally, I think there's a good brand study out there that your second tier competitors are the ones who come up with the most innovative things for aviation. Like there's people that are always trying to get, and I think that's true for most commercial things out there. Like Sears Roebuck died their own death over in the U.S., right? And then you have other companies that are trying to, consistently innovate, and they're finding new ways, and that's just how the world works. So what we have to do in the defense industry is get more of those smaller companies into making things. Giving Boeing a contract for the EX, in my opinion, is not the way to do that, especially spanning that, over time. Granted, the Air Force has an option to buy kind of in blocks where, they can cut it off at any point in time, which is super smart, and they structure the contract pretty smart. So as much as I don't like it, the way that the Air Force seemed to structure everything seemed to make a lot more sense from how they were going to do it. There's some other internal stuff that nobody really cares about, and some super nerdy stuff I can go on and talk about as far as OFPs go, and who owns what, and who holds software hostage, and who, you can't put this thing on without paying this guy money, and, all that sort of stuff. But I guess we'll keep it pretty simple with that, and just say that I would do 10-year contracts. I would get fighters in, and I would have them, a requirement to be a certain commonality of systems or cockpits or flyability, anything that would make, your logistics from pilot training to, some maintenance requirements simple, and kind of keep that streamlined while innovating on the technology side of the house, which I think we could do, relatively easy. But
one of the things that people talk about with regards to the F-35, or the people that I've spoken to who have flown it have talked about with regards to the F-35, is that there are compromises that are there because other nations are involved in the program. And I'll give you an example: the canopy bow. That's there because the Royal Air Force wanted a canopy bow, because they wanted the front part of the canopy to be reinforced because of flying into birds in Europe. Apparently the birds are heavier, more likely to go through the windscreen than they would be anywhere else in the world. I don't know if that's true. So guys talk about flying the F-35 and say there's a big canopy bow, which obscures their vision. It shouldn't be there, and the only reason it's there is because there are other nations involved. And then, of course, you've got three designs, and the argument amongst detractors of the F-35 is that none of them really are that good. Do you think that the idea that air forces, nations, should share the development work, or share the cost of developing a new fighter or a new airframe, is still valid? Is it short-sighted, or actually does it make sense? Because they are prohibitively expensive to design and build.
So in my opinion, been a fairly uneducated opinion, I'll tell you that. I think I would rather go with competition over cooperation or jointness as far as development, like fighter development goes. And that's pretty much it. And I think that there's an engineering way to kind of have your cake and eat it too, as far as modularity goes, and be able to not really compromise on stuff, but just have more innovative design when it comes to meeting two requirements at the same time. I think there's a lot of that you can do, but yeah, the whole JFS program and how it emerged from what its original requirements were, and then pre-requirements and JAST program on up to where it eventually came out. And you really think about it, when it was designed, right? It was designed before thumb drives were a thing, and now you have this explosion in processing power and memory and software, et cetera, et cetera. And that has a huge impact to avionics and sensors and what a jet can process. And then you have to think about so that commercial explosion, in my opinion, happened through competition. To get specifically to your point, whether other nations should be involved in it, I don't know. There's an element of foreign military sales that are great, and a jointness of operating concept and being able to share things with your allies and try to have everybody have the best stuff at all times, and then make sure that your relationships are really good. However, I would say if I were king for a day again, what I would try to export really is a kind of like an innovation ecosystem, and that's totally a buzzword, but a bullshit word. But it would almost be like a process where don't give a man a fish, you can teach him how to fish, sort of thought, right? So if you export that sort of innovation system that can adapt to whatever the threat is, because let's face it, if you buy an F-35 right now and you're planning on keeping it for 40 years, do you have any idea what combat is going to look like in 40 years? I mean, I don't think anybody does. We don't know what any other, what any country is going to do, or how they're going to defeat us with, small munitions, or there could be a total revolution in, F-35 countermeasures that could come out in 10 years from now. And then you would be stuck. You would have bought the farm. So you really need the system in place to be able to adapt to that faster, and say, hey, we can innovate and we can create and we can do this. And without the need to do economies of scale. This is a slight sidebar, but what I fundamentally believe is that if you look at things a little bit more out of the container and say, do you really need economies of scale to make a good, fighter? Because it's essentially what the F-35, the whole selling point was, right? If we all cooperate on this, we'll make a lower cost fighter for everybody, right? It'll lower the cost of development. We'll get all these capabilities, et cetera. It'll lower the cost. Did that happen? I think we can all probably say it didn't, right? So I think if we look at things like not necessarily economies of scale, and there's a really good book by this guy named Hemant Taneja, who talks about economies of unscale. There's a whole other conversation that we can have at some point, but super adaptable ecosystems that can produce what you need when you need it, versus having to buy a million widgets that can only do 3 or 4 purposes. Anyways, you get the point. But I think if we shift the way that we think a little bit more, we could probably have a better product for less money, and have a more adaptable way to iterate those things, or when we need to, basically is what I'm saying. So to answer your question, I don't like the joint. I don't like the jointness thing. I'm not sold on it. And I don't think that cooperating with other nations is the way to go. I think you guys over there building the Tempest and all that sort of stuff, I think is probably the way to go. Because I honestly think that you guys are probably better off that way. Yeah.
Does the software side of things, so you mentioned how you mentioned OFPs a second ago and talked about some of the politics and the complexities and the intellectual property rights and all that kind of stuff that sit in around those. And I get your point about, introducing competition and competition being healthy, and you shouldn't just have three primary contractors and be tied to whatever products and whatever price they come up with. But does the realization or the reality that software is probably the key component? So if let's say your hardware is there, you've got the processing power, you have an airframe that's capable of flying as high and as fast and as long as it needs to in order to execute the mission as it's understood today. Does the fact that it's actually then really down to software undermine the argument against something like the F-15EX? So maybe some of those subsystems are old, but if it's got a very fast processor, if it has the capability of running an AESA radar, the EPAWS, electronic warfare suite, IRST, infrared search and track, a bunch of missiles, can throw out a huge number of AIM-120s in one go, and the reality then that someone could come along and just put a new OFP program into it or add some new hardware and then add capabilities through software, does that undermine the argument against that kind of platform at all? And the other thing, so just I wanted to mention it because I don't know if you're familiar with it, but I suspect you will be. But I read recently that the U2 had been reprogrammed in flight. I think they're using Kubernetes, using containerized software to upload a new, I don't know what it is that they did with it exactly, but it was on an operational mission, and they uploaded a new software load to it to presumably get it to do something they wanted it to do based on what it found when it was up there in terms of what it was monitoring, what it was trying to detect. Does that mean that actually it is all about software and that the platform doesn't really matter anymore?
So, yes and no, and it depends a little bit. Let's take the EX, for example. You could have some really, really, really great software in there. You could have software that could predict black swan events, and have some crazy algorithm that no one's ever discovered. But at the end of the day, if you're trying to do something kinetically, even something non-kinetically, use sensors or whatever, there is a hardware component to them, and there are certain physics laws that apply to that. So I would say that software is and being upgradable is no doubt a thing, and it is a huge thing. And there's an argument that software companies would be better off as the primes, making hardware as a secondary than hardware companies, traditional, companies like Boeing, doing software as kind of a secondary. Definitely an argument there, and I can totally see that. But at the end of the day, physics does apply to things that travel through, every medium, including the air, sea, space, everything. And you mentioned AIM-120s, and AIM-120 could have the greatest software in the world, but if the rocket motors are only capable of getting an X amount of miles, then who cares, right? And similar thing with the jet. And when you get into sensors and spectrums and seeing multi different spectrums and trying to figure out how to target something, a lot of that goes back to a hardware aspect as well. And software is a huge component. I'm not trying to undersell it, but it's just, unless you're talking about having a cyber war, via computer, then there's still going to be a hardware component with it. And my thoughts would be that I think that you should continue to iterate on the hardware side as well, and propulsion side, and solving problems that we have. The Pacific is a really big place, and fuel is an issue, and range is an issue, and solving that via different means of propulsion, or reducing a logistics burden for Jet A fuel to Island X is a big win for a lot of different scenarios that you could find yourself in. So it's not all software, but software is a huge part of it. Don't get me wrong, and we need good people. If that, I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah, it's an answer.
It's an answer.
It's an answer. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the Pacific. Then, I mean, if you think about someone like China, and the potential, for some kind of conflict with them in the future, and having just said 5 or 6 minutes ago, we don't know what warfare is going to look like in 30, 40 years' time, and maybe not even in 10 years' time. What are the things that go through your mind in regards to, potentially going up against China in that theatre?
If we were to go against China in that theater, there's a couple things that would come to mind. Whether it's intrinsically a military problem or intrinsically a political problem, how we would handle that in either way. If it were to be kinetic primarily, how would that solve some strategic questions that we would, go up against? And really, it would depend on the exact scenario, the exact circumstances that you found yourself in. But one of the things that would come to mind would be solving I think logistics would be a problem to solve for sure. And how do we solve that? How do we solve an influence problem over there? How do we win more friends in the Pacific? And I don't know, there's actually a lot of little problems that are probably non-military related that I think would influence more of the military operation than just drawing a bunch of red circles and arrows on a map and talking about whether a J-20 is better than an F-35. I don't think that those are crucial arguments to have necessarily, but I think that a lot of the other arguments are way more important, such as influence, the regional politics, logistics for sure. If you were trying to do any operation, if you look back in history and you see like War Plan Orange, which was the U.S. war plan against the Japanese prior to Pearl Harbor, of what they would do if the Japanese invaded specific islands. A lot of it was about fighting your way back, island hopping, as it were, and sea power was a huge part of that, naturally. But if you look at that, the logistics piece of any operation that involves, the Pacific Ocean is worth pouring a ton of R&D into. But yeah, that would be one of the things I would be thinking about most, probably.
Tying it back to what you were talking about with regards to the military-industrial complex, the bang for buck, the quality of the output based on the quality of the competition. We're going up against, so from a kinetic perspective, going up against China, would probability of kill and the quality of what you had, do you think make the difference? I ask because I suppose quantity, the old saying is quantity has a quality of its own. And if you were going to go up against a far superior force, I'm imagining that every time you fire a missile or you use a jammer or whatever it is that has an effect on the enemy, you want it to work. You don't want it to have a 50% chance of working or achieving the desired outcome, the desired effect. Does that factor into your thinking? Is that something that requires more time and attention and focus, or do you feel that you're at a point where the capability is there?
No, I don't feel like the capability is there. I think that we have a lot of great stuff, and there's a lot of great stuff in the break glass in case of emergency, on that shelf. But I don't think that, as it stands right now, I'm not really sure that we're capable of evolving past a day one or day two kinetic scenario. And once you go, so warfare, we start day one, and we think about initial capabilities a lot and whether our stuff right now is better than their stuff right now. But the bigger discussion to have would be, is our stuff capable of being better on day 2 than their stuff is, or day 3 or day 4? And how can we learn? And then how can we iterate or develop our stuff to be better than theirs are? Which is where the software piece comes in, back to our conversation before, being able to learn, being able to throw in, new things, or collect data, and then fuse that together and then come up with a better capability at the end of the day. That piece is probably the piece that I worry about the most, is our capability to rapidly do that fast. There might be some advertised capability to do that, somewhere along the line. But as far as like down to the actual, the warfighter fighting, a fighter squadron fighting out of a semi-austere location, or whatever, or not using the big infrastructure, the big, what we talked about with logistics wise, maybe cut off lines of communication or cut off, et cetera, not being able to iterate that fast enough, and not being able to be self-contained to make that happen. That's the part that I worry about. I think we're capable of it if we change things around with acquisition, PPPE. There are a bunch of different ways, but yeah. So as far as probability of kill goes, that would probably be my biggest concern overall. The day 2 plus war.
Do you get the sense that your sort of wider thoughts are shared amongst your colleagues in the Air Force? I mean, I wouldn't ask you to tell me what you think General Brown is talking about, or what he should be doing. But do you think these are conversations that go on at higher levels in the Air Force? So
my observation is kind of a nobody would be that I think a lot of the stuff maybe happens at a high level, but I don't think it happens at a mid level. And people may pay lip service to a lot of the things that we're talking about, but as far as just getting it done at the end of the day, I'm not 100% sure that we're there collectively yet. One of the great spots for a fighter squadron has always been the squadron bar. That's where all the bright ideas are shared, and everybody's, stories and understandings and how things really happen versus how they were written in a book happen. But obviously with COVID and stuff like that, that's limited the interaction that people have had at squadron bars and other social, places. So I think that general consensus is shared amongst the bureau level of, we're really going to have to figure this thing out. And a lot of guys are having some of these conversations now, but and I think they're happening at a fairly high level, and they understand that. I think the mid level is a little bit more less in touch with that, I would say, and to be honest, they have a fair amount of political maneuvering to do as well. So there's other drivers of things that may be more important than these things at the time. So, yeah.
It's an interesting point, because I think one of the things that you sort of observe, or one observes, with an outgoing chief of staff and an incoming one, is people will say, well, I thought this guy was going to come in and do all this stuff, and he didn't. Maybe the next guy, he was in my squadron, I know he was a great guy, and he was my 06, and yeah, he'll get stuff done, and then it sort of repeats, and I wonder whether or not actually it's just the way it works. It's how it is. And you can go in. I mean, let's take you as an example. If you were to rise through the ranks of the Air Force, you might just get to the point where you realize actually these things cannot be done. The best you can do is influence. And but having said that, I also then hear about good guys or girls in the Air Force who are sort of star chasing a little bit, and they start off as being well respected and full of principle and ambition and ideas, and then as soon as the possibility of them getting a star comes up, they change a little bit. They become a little bit risk averse. They're not prepared to ruffle feathers. If you think of that as perhaps being the opposite of someone like Robin Olds, that seems to be the story as well. So perhaps it's just a case of it is what it is, and you can't really change it. It won't change.
Yep. There's something to be said about that, right? There's the bureaucracy, I use that term kind of loosely. The bureaucracy has behaviors that it rewards and behaviors that it punishes, right? And everybody ends up knowing what those behaviors are. And then that's how normally you get kind of up the ladder. And in some cases, if your risky bet pays off, then you're rewarded with it and you go up, you're good. If your risky bet does not pay off, then you're not, that's it usually. So there's a risk management of that happens as you go up the rank. It's kind of like, if you're going to go out and dip money into the stock market and, you throw $10 out there, to buy into whatever, you don't really give a shit what happens to it. But let's say you have $100,000 and that's, and then you're like, okay, this is it. And I'm wagering all this on this one bet, and you're going to be more cautious and more, you're going to do a lot more research, and the answer is always going to be no, and and all this sort of stuff. So that, I think that's what happens as you get more, generally as you get more responsibility. So a lot of stuff at the bottom ranks, you're easy to say, well, that's bullshit, or we can make this happen, or we can do this, or whatever, and then and maybe once you get to the very, very top, you kind of realize that, hey, maybe I should have taken more risk, or should have done this, or should have done that to be able to make it better. Or there's no catalyst for change, which is probably what's happening moreover right now. There hasn't been a really big war enough for people to say, like, it's either sink or swim. Everybody's pretty okay holding mediocrity at this point. And mediocrity gets promoted for the most part, as long as you don't, like you said, ruffle any feathers. And it's really about being as diplomatic as you possibly can, to everybody, and likable. And, this guy's super likable and he does this and does that. And we kind of run into a little bit, at the fighter squadron at a level of tactics. And it's easy to be really, really well liked if you're always nodding your head. Yep, that's a great idea. Yep, that's I understand. Yep, I'll keep learning. And all this sort of stuff. On the other hand, if you're like, no, dude, that's 100% bullshit, and that's never going to work because of these reasons right here, you're making yourself a lot more vulnerable to being wrong. You could be totally wrong, or you could be right, and the person who came up with those tactics you're talking to, and he doesn't want to, either he doesn't want to admit that there's holes in his plan, or I don't know, maybe he thinks that he has more experience than you in making these decisions, or or he's right, and he could have all those things for sure. But usually the nature in the fighter squadron is to poke people in the chest when they need to, and not whatever. But there's a slow change, I would say, happening. I think where I feel like people are getting a little bit more. They're building a little bit bigger appetite for risk, and experimenting a little bit more around, and not necessarily saying that I have to be a yes man all the way to the top. So I think that culture is changing. I'm not sure that it's fully there yet, or where it needs to be overall. So, like for example, even saying the EX stuff is a little bit of heresy, in my world, because that's the holy grail of the E model community, is the EX is the next best thing, and all this sort of stuff.
Do you think that the wars, such as they are, the conflicts, the limited conflicts in things like Syria and Libya in 2011, do you think cumulatively they will have an effect, or do you think actually it's just a sort of trickle of change, and not that we need a war, but if you wanted that sort of change to come, the bigger changes to come, then you'd have to have a more substantial conflict? Is there, I guess what I'm really asking in a strange way is, does the Air Force just need more of the right type of people or actually is it an event that would create that change?
Yeah, I think that an event would. Yeah, there would have to be a catalyst to be able to make some substantial change, and the real change that I'm talking about really is going to be an appetite for risk, and not just any risk. Being able to vision or see into the future a little bit, and then be able to make a wager on that, and know that you might be wrong or you might be right, but have a good feeling that you're going to be right, and then not be afraid to go with that. With a lot of the conflicts that we've gotten into, and we talked last time, and some of them were super complex from a strategic level, extremely complex with multiple strategic audiences. And then this whole matrix decision tree that you never really knew where it was going to end up, right? So from a risk perspective, the easiest thing in most of those cases would be to not do anything, or to try to lower the amount of risk and then point to the scenario to say, well, it was very, very complicated and we just erred on the side of low risk, because we didn't think it was worth it to stir the bee's nest for no reason, which is valid. But the problem with that is it creates a strain of thinking through everybody that low risk is the default and the best decision to make. However, I actually could use a little scenario out of Syria when we talked about the vehicle-borne IEDs, whether you were going to drop a munition or not, and you had the likelihood of you could hit a refugee vehicle or it could be a VBID, and you didn't really know for sure. So you had a lot of risk there, whether it was going to pay off or not. And the risk of not doing anything is almost equal to the risk of doing something, so I think in a scenario where you get into a conflict with a peer competitor, we're going to have to change around the risk calculus that we have right now to saying that the risk of not doing something is way more than the risk of doing something and being wrong about it. And that type of thinking is just not inherent in the Air Force and to a greater extent the DoD right now, save for a few individuals. And I'm not really sure why. It's just is what it is.
Can you get that? You talked right at the beginning about the linear nature of what goes on at Nellis in terms of red flag. There's a line, and once you cross it, anyone in front of you is a bad guy, and anyone behind you is a goodie. Do the structures and the tools and the facilities and the simulations exist within your community, at least, to allow you to train against a peer adversary? Could you adequately simulate someone like, heaven forbid, Russia or China as an adversary?
Yes and no. I don't think that we do a really job of it right now. I think we have the tools and capability to do a good job at it, though. And it would take a really a deep dive into red teaming scenarios and really poking holes in invalidating tactics that we have now. So there's kind of a weird political rift, I guess you could say, internal politics of invalidating tactics or invalidating programs of record or invalidating munitions or capability, whatever it is. So you really don't. A lot of people are not comfortable with designing a scenario that would, make all your stuff on a day-to-day basis obsolete. However, I think we're going to have to get to the point where we're really, really red teaming our own weaknesses day in and day out and a lot more frequently, which is what I would imagine a peer fight to look like. From a pure technical or technology standpoint, sure, whatever. But from an actual tactical perspective, if we were really serious about fighting peer adversaries, we would really have to think about how are we going to solve really complex problems that they're throwing at us based on assessing our own weaknesses, and then keep that flowing. So I don't think that we're there yet as a entity, and I don't think that we really critically think through a lot of that stuff. But hopefully we can get there with enough poking and prodding overall. So to answer your question, I think, the capabilities, we have the capability to do that. Whether we're exercising right now, I don't think is the case.
We talked a little I can't remember if it was the first, well, it was one interview we did, one conversation we did, went on for 2 hours or so, and I released it as 2 parts. I can't remember which part I released it in, but we talked a little bit about the multitude of mission sets that the Strike Eagle has. And I suppose that what you've just said touches also a little on the wide range of potential conflicts that you could be involved in. So, as a community in an aeroplane that can do so many different things, it must be a challenge to be able to say on the one hand, well, our squadron is ready to go up against someone like China, but our squadron is also ready to go and do CAS in Syria when there are sort of 3 or 4 different factions on the ground, and actually what we're dealing with is people fleeing in sort of buses, and identifying whether or not that bus is full of refugees or if that's a vehicle-borne IED. That wasn't a question, so I'll make it into a question. Is it difficult?
Yeah, it is for sure. It definitely is. It's difficult to know if what you're focusing on is the right thing, or if it's worth it, or if it's irrelevant, whatever. And I think we venture down the path of irrelevancy a lot more than we venture down the path of relevancy. And, like we talked about the first time, a big portion of it is just technical proficiency in the jet, of being able to do, push buttons and do things, and, put your jet where it needs to be and do things. And that's great. As far as unpacking the tactical picture of Syria, or tactical picture of, Russia or China or whatever, a lot of that takes a concerted effort of each individual's member to stay sharp on intel, all the intel analysis that's going around, as well as normal news analysis and what think tanks are saying about specific regions, and going to specific analysts for stuff that is country specific, building a context, understanding how they fight war, understanding how war is likely to be fought, and then framing your mind around all those things and how they come together, and getting mentally prepared yourself for that. I think that's less of an institutional thing and more of an individual thing. And like I said, these are all conversations that we'd have at the squadron bar, about, how Russia, what Russia's Zapad exercise in 2021 is going to be like, or what their, political ambitions are for the Arctic, or what, all those things are kind of what we would talk about, and how they're going to use, how would they use force? How would they not use force? What would drive them to use force in a certain way? And the same could be said about, Iran or Syria, or, any other potential conflict spot. We would hopefully start having these conversations and think about the realistic implications of not just reenacting the Gulf War to every single country, out there. We would have to think about tailoring certain capabilities and certain things, and certain, and getting mentally prepared to be able to make those decisions and make them count at a strat level, I think. So that. And we would talk about BFM and all the other cool stuff too. So,
final question then, and we've already sort of referenced this a little. I suppose sort of tangentially we've referenced it a little, but 5th gen capabilities. You talked about what does their capability, what does the adversary's capability look like on day 2, day 3, so on and so forth. So non-permissive environment, you probably on day 1 it's going to be the stealthy platforms, the 5th gens going in, kicking down the door, taking out strategic targets, to allow then, I guess, on day 2, some of the 4.5 gen fighters to come in and do their stuff in a slightly more permissive environment. How is the Strike Eagle community's work going with integrating with people flying the F-35? I suppose F-22 has been around a lot longer, but F-35 in particular, are you spending time working out how to operate in tandem with them? Is that an easy thing to do? Does it require you to relearn certain things? Does it just add a second set of sort of playbooks that you've got to memorize? What does it look like?
So with our integration of the 5th gen, we do that actually. The squadron I'm in currently, we've done that quite a bit. So we've done exercise with the Raptor dudes and the F-35 guys, both. Even Marine F-35s, in addition to the Air Force F-35s, and we've kind of learned a little bit more about their capes and what they're capable of, and how they would integrate with us and what they could offer, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that which is great and really cool. The problem that we run into a lot of times is a lot of the 4th gen, community has a belief that, oh, don't worry, the 5th gen guys are going to handle, all the heavy lifting. We're going to come in at the end. And we're going to clean up all the, all this stuff, which I don't really think is 100% realistic. And I think a lot of contingency operations revolve around what unit is available, what unit can get there fast enough, and where specific units are at specific times. So for 4th gen, you could be rotated in, and you could have, F-35s could be stretched thin, in some other area of the world, and you could be the only ones there, or sometimes war doesn't follow a specific timeline of events that you would prefer. So sometimes it's just whoever's there and available. The other thing is maintenance availability when it comes to producing lines, and there's a logistics tail that follows that. With, can we get parts for, F-22s in theater? Can we, there's a whole bigger, cycle that has to take place. So I don't think that everything, I don't think you can bank on everything being a perfect operation that you plan to, that you just, 5th gen is going to go in and they're going to do all these cool things. And then 4th gen is going to come in. We're going to clean up a bunch of stuff. And, we're going to have this perfect integration that flows in. I don't think that is necessarily realistic. It's possible, but who knows if that'll happen. So the integration piece is really cool. And I really enjoy it with those guys. And we've learned a lot about them and what they're capable of and what they're not capable of. They have some weaknesses as well, and we can find those out and help them out where we can. But they have some strengths that we haven't seen before, and they have some really cool stuff that they can do. And I don't want to undersell the 5th gen guys, because they can do a lot of great stuff.
Would you want to fly it? Would you want to fly the F-35?
Yeah, I think it'd be cool to fly, to be honest with you. I love flying the Strike Eagle. I think it'd be great to fly the F-35. I love flying different types. So, it'd be great to see all the stuff that they do. I think the F-35 has some cool pieces to their tactical evolution about how they use each airframe that the Strike Eagle community is lacking right now. We're trending in that direction, but they use some of their capabilities to their advantage in unique and novel ways, which I think is awesome. So it'd be great to fly. There are some things about the Strike Eagle, though, I really love. Strike Eagle is a pretty good pilot's jet as far as, you pull back on the stick and nothing's limited you. You can do, there's guys who have pulled 12 Gs in that jet, and it's pretty it's a good flying jet, and it's a jet that you fly 100%, and it's super fun jet to fly. I think, but so I don't know if the F-35 would be a lot more automated, maybe not as cool from a pilot perspective. I don't know. I've never flown it. But I think it'd be cool to, see what it can do and fly it and stuff.